The morning sun cast its golden glow over my quiet farm, painting the fields in hues of amber and rust. The rooster had just finished his crowing, and the soft clucking of my hens filled the crisp air as I made my way to the coop. There was a certain peace that came with this routine, gathering the fresh eggs, feeling their warmth in my hands, knowing that soon they'd be part of a hearty breakfast. But as I approached the nesting boxes, my heart dropped. They were empty, not a single egg in sight. I had collected the last batch yesterday afternoon, so there was no way my hens hadn't laid overnight. My eyes scanned the ground, looking for signs of broken shells, any indication that a fox or raccoon had stolen them. But there was nothing. The realization set in like a slow burn. Someone had taken them. And I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly who. Karen had moved next door a year ago, bringing with her an air of entitlement that didn't sit well with folks around here. She wasn't like the other neighbors, those who waved when they drove past, who'd stop by with homemade pies just to check in. No, Karen didn't believe in courtesy. She believed in taking. She had already borrowed tools from my shed without asking, let her dog run loose through my vegetable garden, and complained to the county about the smell of my barn, on a farm, of all places. And now, she was stealing my eggs. I had seen her the other day, loitering by the fence, her eyes fixed on the coop. I had thought nothing of it then, just another instance of her nosiness. But now I knew better. I checked the latch on the coop door. It hadn't been forced open. Whoever had taken the eggs had done so carefully, deliberately, and the only way to do that was by reaching over the fence. The thought of Karen's manicured hands sneaking in, plucking away my hard-earned eggs, made my blood boil. This wasn't about the eggs themselves, though. It was about principle. Out here, people respected each other. They worked hard for what they had. You didn't just take from your neighbor and expect to get away with it. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty nesting boxes, my mind racing. I could march over to her house, demand she return what was mine, but that would only lead to an argument, one she'd deny, twisting the situation in her favor. No, I needed to be smarter than that. Karen thought she was clever, sneaky, but if she wanted to play games, I'd give her one she'd never forget. That afternoon, I got to work. The first thing I did was set up a camera near the coop, hidden where she wouldn't see it. If she tried this again, I'd have proof. But that was just the beginning. I had something else in mind, something that would make sure she never even thought about stealing from me again. I had read an old trick once, something farmers used to do to stop egg thieves, whether they were animals or people. It was simple. All I had to do was take a few eggs, hollow them out, and fill them with something unexpected, something unpleasant. With a smirk, I carefully poked a small hole in a few of my eggs, draining them out before refilling them with a mixture of mustard and hot sauce, the kind of burn that lingered. I sealed the holes carefully, making sure they looked just like any other fresh egg. Then, I placed them back in the nesting boxes, right where Karen would find them. All I had to do now was wait. The following morning, I rose before the sun, the anticipation thrumming through me as I made my way to the coop. The dew was still thick on the grass, the air carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and hay. My boots crunched softly on the gravel path as I approached the nesting boxes, my pulse steady but expectant. Sure enough, just as I had suspected, the bait was gone. The normal eggs were untouched, but the ones I had carefully prepared, those were missing. A slow smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. Karen had taken the bait, and if everything went according to plan, she was in for quite the surprise. But I wasn't about to gloat just yet. I needed to see the proof. I hurried back to the house and pulled up the footage from the small camera I had hidden near the coop. As I fast-forwarded through the night, the screen showed only the usual movements, the rustling of hens, the shifting shadows from the trees swaying in the wind. And then, just past 3 in the morning, there she was, a dark figure moving cautiously along the fence, her silhouette unmistakable. She stood there for a moment, scanning the area as if making sure no one was watching. Then, slowly, she reached over, her hands disappearing into the nesting box. Even in the dim light, I could see the gleam of eggs in her grip as she quickly stuffed them into a small bag. And just like that, she was gone. I let out a breath, a mix of satisfaction and irritation churning inside me. She had done this before. This wasn't a one-time mistake, a moment of desperation. No, Karen had been stealing from me repeatedly, and she had the nerve to sneak around like some common thief. But now, she was about to learn that actions have consequences. I knew it wouldn't take long. Mustard and hot sauce had a way of making their presence known, and by now, she would have cracked open one of those eggs, expecting a fresh yolk only to be met with a mouthful of fiery regret. It was just after sunrise when the first sign of trouble reached me. A high-pitched screech shattered the quiet morning air, followed by the sound of furious coughing. I didn't have to guess where it was coming from. Smirking, I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped onto my porch just in time to see Karen storming toward my house, her face red as a ripe tomato, her hands clenched into fists. Her walk was unsteady, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, and I knew the heat was still burning her tongue. I had to fight the urge to laugh. She didn't bother knocking. She stomped right up to my front door and for a second seemed torn between yelling and trying to breathe. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, and when she finally managed to speak, her voice was hoarse, filled with both fury and discomfort. But I already knew exactly what she was going to say. The complaints, the accusations, the attempt to play the victim, it was all written across her face. The woman who had been sneaking onto my property in the dead of night, stealing what wasn't hers, now had the audacity to act like she had been wronged. Her mouth moved, her voice garbled, but I stood there, arms crossed, waiting. I wanted her to say it. I wanted her to admit, in front of me, what she had done. But Karen being Karen wasn't about to confess so easily. Instead, she waved a shaking hand in the air, as if trying to summon words that wouldn't come. I could almost see the moment the realization dawned on her, the moment she understood that admitting the truth would only incriminate herself. So instead, she changed tactics. "This is harassment," she finally choked out, her voice a strangled mix of rage and desperation. You poisoned me." Poisoned. The accusation hung in the air between us, ridiculous and desperate. I arched an eyebrow, barely suppressing the laugh threatening to escape. This was what she had come up with? Instead of admitting that she had stolen my eggs, she was trying to twist it around, making herself the victim. Classic Karen. I let a slow silence stretch between us, watching her squirm, her lips still swollen from the heat, her nostrils flaring as if she could somehow exhale the burn away. She wanted a reaction. She wanted a fight. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I simply leaned against the doorframe, my expression calm, controlled. "Well," I finally said, my voice as casual as if we were discussing the weather, "if you got sick, maybe you should be more careful about where you get your food from." Her eyes widened, fury and embarrassment flashing across her face in rapid succession. She had no comeback for that, no excuse, no way to deny what had just been so plainly stated. For a moment, I thought she might actually lunge at me, her fingers twitching at her sides, her whole body vibrating with pent-up frustration. But she didn't, because deep down, she knew. She knew she had been caught. And worse, she knew there was nothing she could do about it. I watched as her lips pressed into a thin, angry line, her hands tightening into fists before she spun on her heel and stormed off, her furious footsteps crunching against the gravel. She didn't look back. She didn't say another word. She just stomped across the field, her shoulders squared, her pride in shambles. I stood there for a long moment, letting the victory settle in, then turned back toward my quiet home, a satisfied smile lingering on my lips. Karen had learned her lesson, and if she was smart, she wouldn't try that again. The morning air still carried a sharp chill, but the warmth spreading through me had nothing to do with the sun rising over the pastures. As I watched Karen storm back toward her house, her back stiff with indignation, I knew she wouldn't let this go so easily. Karen wasn't the kind of person to admit defeat, even when she was caught red-handed. No, she was the type to twist reality until it fit her own narrative, and I had a feeling this wasn't over yet. But that was fine by me. I had lived on this farm long enough to know how to handle pests, whether they had 4 legs or 2. I went about my morning chores, collecting the real eggs from the coop, feeding the horses, checking the fences. It was a routine I had followed for years, and there was something grounding about it, something steady. But just as I was finishing up, movement near my property line caught my eye. Karen stood by the fence, her arms crossed, her expression pinched with something that almost resembled calculation. She wasn't fuming anymore. No, this was something else. I knew that look. It was the look of someone plotting their next move. Sure enough, an hour later, the sound of tires crunching on my driveway pulled me from my work. A county officer's truck rolled up, stopping just short of my porch. I sighed, wiping my hands on my jeans before stepping forward. Officer Miller, a man I'd known for years, climbed out of the vehicle with a weary expression, the kind that told me he already knew this was a waste of his time. "Morning," he said, adjusting his belt as he approached. "Got a complaint filed against you." I didn't have to ask who had filed it. Karen had wasted no time. I simply raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "She's saying you tried to poison her," he went on, rubbing the back of his neck as if he couldn't believe he was actually saying the words out loud. "Said she ate something from your farm and got sick. Wants me to press charges." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I let out a slow breath and shook my head. Karen was as predictable as they came. If she couldn't get away with stealing, she'd try to turn herself into the victim. But Miller wasn't an idiot, and he wouldn't be here if he actually thought there was a real case. "Let me guess," I said, tilting my head. "She didn't happen to mention that she stole the eggs in the first place, did she?" Miller sighed, glancing toward the fence line where Karen's house sat, her curtains twitching, as she no doubt watched from inside. He shifted his weight, his expression carefully neutral. "I figured there was more to it," he admitted. "Thought I'd hear your side before making any decisions." I didn't say anything. Instead, I pulled out my phone and played the footage from my coop camera, letting it speak for itself. The grainy night vision image showed Karen creeping over the fence, reaching into the nesting boxes and swiping the eggs. It was undeniable, clear as day. Miller let out a long whistle as he watched. "Well," he muttered, scratching his chin, "that's something all right." He didn't waste much time after that. He climbed back into his truck and drove straight to Karen's house. I stayed where I was, leaning against the fence as I watched him knock on her door. She answered almost immediately, her expression flipping from feigned innocence to wide-eyed surprise as Miller spoke to her. She gestured wildly, shaking her head, her arms flailing in exaggerated disbelief. But then he showed her the footage, and the fight drained from her like air from a punctured tire. The conversation didn't last long after that. Karen's voice grew shrill for a moment before Miller simply turned away, leaving her standing in her doorway, red-faced and furious. He didn't bother coming back to me. He didn't need to. I already knew how this had ended. For the rest of the day, Karen's house remained eerily silent. No dramatic stomping across my yard, no shouting from her porch. I almost wondered if she'd finally learned her lesson. But I should have known better. Karen wasn't the type to give up. She was the type to stew in her own bitterness, plotting her next move. And sure enough, by the time evening rolled around, she was back. Not in person this time, but in the form of a new trick. As I stepped out onto my porch after dinner, a strange smell filled the air. Something rotten, something putrid. My stomach turned as I followed the scent, my boots crunching over the gravel until I reached the fence line. There, dumped right along my property, was a pile of broken eggshells, their insides smeared across the dirt like some childish act of revenge. The smell was unbearable, the stench of spoiled yolks mixed with something else, something deliberate, a petty, spiteful act. Karen's way of trying to get back at me. I shook my head, the amusement in my chest hardening into something sharper. If she wanted to play dirty, I could play smarter. I had let her off easy this time, but if she thought she could keep pushing, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The stench of the rotting eggs lingered in the air long after the sun dipped below the horizon, a rancid reminder of Karen's childish defiance. The sight of broken shells scattered along the fence line made my stomach turn. But more than that, it solidified what I already knew. Karen wasn't going to back down quietly. She couldn't accept defeat, couldn't handle the reality that she had been caught and embarrassed. No, she had to lash out, had to make one last desperate attempt to prove she still had control. But she had underestimated one thing. Out here, we didn't waste time with petty games. Out here, consequences came swift and undeniable. If Karen thought this mess was going to rattle me, she had another thing coming. The first thing I did was grab a shovel. If she thought I was going to let her nonsense sit there, stinking up my farm, she was wrong. I scooped up the rancid mess, the putrid yolks leaking into the dirt as I dumped them into a bucket. The whole time, I felt her eyes on me from behind her curtains. She was watching, waiting, hoping I'd react. But I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. No yelling, no threats, no confrontation, just a quiet, calculated response. That was the only way to handle someone like her. By the time I finished cleaning up, I had a plan. Karen had proven she wasn't going to stop on her own. If I wanted this to end, I had to make sure she wouldn't have another opportunity to cross the line. So, I did what any smart farmer would do. I fortified my defenses. That night, under the cover of darkness, I reinforced the fencing around my coop, adding an extra layer of height to ensure she couldn't reach over. Then, I installed another camera, one she wouldn't see this time. If she so much as breathed in the direction of my farm, I'd have proof. And if she thought she could keep pulling stunts like this without consequences, she was about to get a rude awakening. The next morning, I went about my chores as usual, acting as if nothing had happened. The eggs in the nesting boxes were exactly where they should be, untouched. The horses trotted lazily across the pasture, the air thick with the smell of hay and damp earth. It was a perfect morning, but there was a tension lingering just beneath the surface, an unspoken warning carried in the wind. It wasn't long before I heard the sound of a car pulling into my driveway. I glanced up to see another county truck rolling to a stop, but this time, it wasn't Officer Miller stepping out. It was someone from the health department. Karen had made another move. The man approached with a clipboard in hand, his expression professional but tired. "We received a complaint about possible food safety violations," he said. "Someone reported that you're selling contaminated eggs." I almost laughed. Karen was getting desperate. She had already tried to paint herself as a victim, and when that didn't work, she was now attempting to ruin my reputation. But she had made one crucial mistake. She didn't know who she was dealing with. I had been running this farm for years, long enough to know every regulation inside and out. I kept meticulous records, made sure my operations were airtight. I didn't argue. I didn't get angry. Instead, I invited him to check the coop, to inspect every last detail of my farm. He walked through carefully, nodding as he examined my setup. He checked my storage areas, my equipment, even my waste disposal. And in the end, he found exactly what I knew he would: nothing. "There's no issue here," he finally said, flipping his clipboard shut. "Everything's up to code." I simply nodded. "Would you mind noting that in your official report?" He gave me a knowing look, then scribbled something down before shaking my hand and leaving. The moment his truck disappeared down the road, I turned my gaze toward Karen's house. I could see her standing on her porch, arms crossed, watching. She had expected me to be blindsided, to scramble, to panic, but all she had done was waste her own time. Later that afternoon, I made one final trip to town. I walked straight into the sheriff's office and filed a formal complaint. Trespassing, theft, harassment, it was all documented now. I handed over the footage from my camera, the proof of her sneaking into my coop, of her childish retaliation. It was all there, undeniable. And by the time the report was processed, a deputy was knocking on Karen's door. This time, there was no argument, no screaming, just a stunned silence as she realized she had pushed too far. The law wasn't on her side. The games were over. She could glare, she could stew in her bitterness, but she couldn't undo what had been set in motion. By the next morning, she was gone. Packed up overnight, her house emptied out like she had never been there at all. Whether she had left out of shame or fear, I didn't care. All I knew was that my farm was finally quiet again. The air was crisp. The land was mine once more, untouched by entitled hands. And as I collected my fresh eggs, the warmth of them settling into my palms, I smiled. Some lessons are learned the hard way. And Karen? She wouldn't forget this one.